Welcome to the third video on Henry Dunbar, a novel published in 3 volumes in 1864, written by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This video contributes to part of the third-year core course in English literature at the University of Greenwich, the part concerned with detective fiction. It's the 6th video in a series tracing the development of detective fiction. You can find other videos for the course either by searching Detective Fiction Greenwich through YouTube, Google, or other search engines, or, if you're interested in the course as a whole, the easiest thing to do is to subscribe to the YouTube channel where you found this video. It's important to know before you go any further that the course is cumulative. That is, it builds on what we've done before. I've tried to make the course intellectually rigorous and coherent by investigating just a few concepts, not just a few texts. For example, you'll find various text boxes appear at several points in this lecture. These contain key terms that were highlighted and defined in the introductory 3 lectures available on YouTube on Edgar Allan Poe. It may be that you'll be able to get a lot out of what follows without listening to and watching the previous lectures. I hope you can. But I think you'll get a lot more if, instead of watching individual lectures out of sequence on YouTube, you start at the beginning of the course and watch the videos in order. For example, I'll be assuming later in the lecture that you've already watched the first 2 lectures in Henry Dunbar. I'll be referring to those first 2 lectures, in fact. And you'll also see in the course of this and the next lecture that I gradually build up a slide of notes on a famous review of sensation fiction from 1863. Now, to return to Henry Dunbar, besides being an early detective novel, Henry Dunbar is also what's called a sensation novel. The blurb from Victorian Secrets, the publisher of the excellent edition of Henry Dunbar by Anne-Marie Bella, describes it as having all the classic ingredients of a sensation novel indeed. These include murder, fraud, mistaken identity, and a train accident. And as we'll see, there are lots of other typical ingredients as well. The review that the blurb quotes, one that appeared in the theatrical journal The Era in June 1864, a month after the novel came out, seems to suggest that the sensation fiction genre relies on plots, strength, animal vivacity, and boldness of incident, or that, at least, Mary Braddon's novels do. And as the blurb from Victorian Secrets also explains, Henry Dunbar was adapted for the stage. That indeed is typical of sensation novels. And like sensation novels in general, it was considered dangerous reading for the impressionable. Although it's not today Mary Braddon's best-known or most studied novel, Henry Dunbar was apparently her most profitable. Now, I'll be covering a lot of the elements that the blurb mentions in the remaining lectures on Henry Dunbar. We'll be investigating what sensation novels are as a genre, what their relationship to the Victorian entertainment industry in general was, and especially how they're related to developments in the publishing industry. For overall, this course is called Literature and Publishing, and this term on detective fiction is only a part of that. Now, to do that, and this will extend to the next YouTube lecture as well, I want to spend time thinking about how one of the now most quoted attacks on sensation fiction describes it. It's a lengthy review of 24 sensation novels in the first issue in 1863 of a high-status journal, the Quarterly Review. This may seem a very strange thing to do, taking seriously what a clearly biased attack on something says, but I do think that if we can leave aside the very evident snobbishness of the piece, it's actually very instructive about the roots of sensation novels and their place in Victorian publishing and literary history. You can find the piece downloadable for free on Google Books. This is where I've taken these images of the pages from. I found it by searching for Quarterly Review 1863. And I'm sure you'll be able to find the complete issue through other means too. The article starts on page 481 and is rather long, and I've extracted the extracts below from a book I edited a long time ago. It came out in 2005 with the wonderful John Plunkett. It's called Victorian Print Media, and you can find extracts from this very long article on pages 55 to 57, with an introduction and notes as well on pages 75 to 76. Henry Dunbar isn't mentioned in this article. That isn't surprising because the article came out a year before Henry Dunbar was published. But as I say, it gives an excellent picture of the publishing context the novel appeared in. The article was published anonymously, which was normal for the time, but it clearly demonstrates the effects of status difference between investigator and investigated, between high culture and low culture. For the author of the article was none other than Henry Longueville Mansel, an Oxford Don who became Regius Professor of Ecclesiastical History 4 years after this piece appeared in the Quarterly Review. He wrote it for one of the 4 principal high-status quarterlies that dominated British intellectual life in the second quarter of the century. From this elevated cultural position, Mansel offers an authoritative, even arrogant overview of sensation in many of its forms. It's easy today to criticize the piece. The works he reviews, for example, are treated as much for muchness, even though they actually targeted different segments of the very broad publishing market. Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret and Aurora Floyd, Wilkie Collins's No Name, Mrs. Henry Wood's Danesbury House are all very different, for example. And he even lumps in from the markedly low status end Mrs. Gordon Smythe's The Daily Governors. And yet, just because Mansel's piece is a snobbish rejection of sensation fiction doesn't mean to say that in many respects it can't help us understand what it's complaining about. One can be correct in one's analysis and yet be wrong in one's attitude. And I find Mansel's discussion of sensation fiction to be very perceptive in many ways. The piece begins, for example, with an implicit reference to sensation sermons through the phrase preaching to the nerves. Contemporary readers would have understood that reference through the instantaneous access to their mental archive. You can see there an example of my use of the text box for one of the key terms. And sensation sermons I have already mentioned in a previous video lecture on Henry Dunbar, when I referred to how the term was used in America in the 1850s. And in the same quotation I showed you there, we have sensation sermons jammed up against sensation novel and sensation editors. By the way, I don't think we're supposed to take very seriously the idea of sensation encyclopedias as a publishing genre like, say, the Encyclopedia Britannica. Rather, the New York Herald seems to be using the term ironically in the sense of a compendious work. I think what's really meant are newspapers, which, when taken cumulatively, can be thought of as encyclopedias of human knowledge and experience. Indeed, encyclopedias of human sensations. Now, what were sensation sermons? As always, searching in periodical and newspaper databases can help us. From the Gale Cengage database Artemis, available to us at the University of Greenwich, I've discovered a few uses of the term sensation in relation to sermons and preaching from the early 1860s. Here's one. You can see it's a cutting in the Morning Post, dated the 17th of April 1860, from our old friend, the New York Herald, from an issue of the 2nd of April, a couple of weeks previously. Mr. Corbett, a sensation Methodist preacher, was ostensibly targeting the thieves and harlots in a church in the red light district of New York. Sensation sermons, as you may imagine, tried to stir up emotion by dealing with crime, and through that emotion to make a congregation reform or take action of some kind. It looks like sensation sermons were very popular, for it's clear the church was very crowded. Not with thieves and harlots, though, as the paper went on to explain. The sensation sermon was packed with the most respectable men and women, theatrical and other celebrities. Half the congregation were ladies, and even old ladies turned up. Members of families snuck in unknown to each other, but they laughed when they met, each thinking the other too respectable to be seen in such a place. But it seems everyone had a lot of fun. One more example from the Artemis database will suffice. This is from a Scottish daily newspaper, the Dundee Courier, dated the 17th of October, 1862. It shows how the sensation sermon, even if it had originated in America, was now firmly ensconced in Britain. Now, I cited this example because I wanted to point out the relation of the crime that the sensation sermon is based on to a recent news story. This is the Glasgow murder. The Glasgow murder was all over the British press in the latter part of 1862. It raised a storm of controversy. The sensation sermon by the Reverend Mr. Graham is just one squall in that vast media storm. The Glasgow murder concerned the brutal murder of a woman servant. After a few weeks, a woman friend of the servant was arrested and in September 1862 stood trial for her murder. The friend resolutely declared her innocence and instead accused the father of the woman's employer, of the servant's employer, of having committed the crime when the servant refused his sexual advances. The jury nonetheless found the friend guilty in less than 15 minutes, and she was sentenced to hang on the 11th of October, less than a week before this sensation sermon, therefore. There was a public outcry, and in an unprecedented action, a court commission was appointed to investigate the evidence in the case. The commission did not declare the friend innocent, but it did commute her sentence to life imprisonment. In fact, the woman served 15 years in Perth General Prison in Australia. She then emigrated to America and died in 1899. Do the issues this case raises about the death penalty, transportation to Australia, resonate with anything in Henry Dunbar for you? I'll leave that for now, but just bear in mind how sensation might be used for thought-provoking purposes, not just to give us pleasure, excitement, or fun. So, that's the archive concerning the sensation sermon. Mansel went on to discuss spasmodic poetry. Spasmodic poetry was the term used in the 1850s. I think you can guess the meaning from Mansel's description of it that you can see on the screen before you. It seeks to communicate the mental convulsions, the shocks that the poet feels. Spasmodic poetry seeks to express the inner emotions of the poet, usually the inner turmoil of the poet. One of the best-known spasmodic poets was Sidney Dobell, and here's a short extract from one of his gentler poems. It may be gentle, but it allows us to consider a lot of the issues and the connections between sensation fiction and spasmodic poetry that Mansel raises in his article. Note the sound effects and the rigorous attention to just one bodily sense, sound. It's worth reading out loud, so I'll do that. from the sad eaves the drip-drop of the rain, the water washing the lateral door, a slow step plashing by upon the moor, a single bleat far from the famished fold, the clicking of an embered hearth and cold, the rainy robin tick-tack at the pane. Doesn't it successfully communicate the effect of the senses, or perhaps how the senses of the body, in other words sensations, are affected by the inner state of the poet? How what he perceives is affected by his inner state, and also how he interprets his sensations. Think of the alternatives. Eaves could be protective instead of sad. The door keeps the water out and so the speaker dry. Someone's coming. Isn't that perhaps welcome? There are possible positives here. There's the sound of a sheep, a living thing outside. Couldn't the poet go and rescue it? And the robin redbreast. How jolly! But no, these alternative actions and reactions to sensations are foreclosed by the inner state of the poet. The sensations are presented to us only to serve as exterior manifestations of the poet's inner state. And note too how the exterior sonic sensations the poet perceives are represented to us through the insistent sound effects, sonic effects, in ways that emphasize how bodies rely on sensations in order to understand communication. Sensations, it seems then, are not only what we perceive, but are necessary for communication of feelings and indeed communication in general. Do you remember the newspaper article? This quotation from the New York Herald from the last video, the second one on Henry Dunbar. Perhaps you recall how unusually I chose to emphasize not the praise of sensation journalism as the highest kind of journalism, which is how the article is normally referred to. I chose to focus on the comment that we have sensation descriptions of the latest sensation done in the sensation style. That is, the sensational news is described sensationally in a sensational way. Isn't this the case with spasmodic poetry? The interior mental pain of the poet is described through the poet's sensation in a style that highlights the reader's senses, the reader's perception of the poet's communication to us. And then there's this shocking poem from the point of view of an army surgeon in the Crimean War who can do almost nothing to help the wounded and dying. He may be a hero with the will of 1,000 men, yet he's only got one body, one pair of hands, and is able to do almost nothing. He's like a bare branch to a brood of chicks who want to be fed by their mother, a branch that they confuse with her. He's as helpless as that branch to feed them. Note again the sound effects and the horror and violence of the language which attempts to shock us, tries to give us a visceral reaction in order to get us inside the mind of the surgeon that the poet is describing. Over that breathing waste of friends and foes, the wounded and the dying, hour by hour, in will 1,000, yet but one in power, he labours through the red and groaning day. The fearful moorland where the myriads lay moved as a moving field of mangled worms, and as a raw brood orphaned in the storms thrust up their heads if the wind bend a spray above them, but when the bare branch performs no sweet parental office, sink away with hopeless chirp of woe. So as he goes, around his feet in clamorous agony, They rise and fall, and all the seething plain bubbles a cauldron vast of many-coloured pain. Mansel's not quite right when he thinks that spasmodic poets like Dobell don't want to create bodily effects in their readers. I think they do, in the same way that sensation sermons want to create effects, indeed create actions in their audiences. But he's right in another way, in that he's noted how sensation is absolutely at the fore of literature, and indeed the whole of print culture of the mid-19th century. A good deal of news, poetry and fiction was concerned with how we need bodies to communicate with, not just minds. This is, of course, unlike Poe's detective Dupin, who relies heavily on newspaper reports. He does explore the crime scene bodily with his senses, but not to the same extent as we're considering here. He relies on mind more than body. In contrast, think about how Margaret in Henry Dunbar desperately wants the evidence of her senses to prove or disprove her suspicions. She wants to see who she thinks is the murderer of her father face to face, body to body. She thinks she will see the evidence of his guilt in his face and force him to acknowledge his culpability. She won't accept communications from a third party. She's assuming that sensations of our bodies reveal the truth. This is the underlying discourse of sensation, empiricism. Empiricism was much discussed at mid-century. Should we have faith in what we can't perceive, or should we believe more what we can perceive, and we can logically infer from general rules and principles? Here's the philosopher J.S. Mill using the term bodily sensations very, very early in his large 2-volume exploration of the principles of evidence and the methods of scientific investigation. Sounds like he's talking about how we should read clues in a text, what the procedures are in the game of detection. It's not just philosophy, it really is something else as well. To return to the Mansel, the spasmodic poets, he claims, were not writing for commercial gain, whereas sensation novelists were. Spasmodic poets were writing for themselves, he says, whereas sensation novels were writing for the market. Just as manufacturers of cloth produce hundreds of yards of cloth all to the same pattern, so sensation novelists churned out novels each according to the same pattern too. But what was this market for sensation novelists? Mansel suggests there are 3 causes of the marketization of literature which is manifest in sensation novels: periodicals, circulating libraries, and railway bookstalls. I'm going to address them one by one, but in the slightly different order that I've presented them in here on the left. I'm also going to add one more commercial element, the theatre, that you can see there. Now, in this video, I'm only going to address the circulating libraries and the periodicals. I'll talk about the railway bookstalls and the theatre in the next video. To start with the circulating libraries then. This is a photograph dating from 1902 of the inside of one of the largest of the circulating libraries from one of Mudi's branches. Mudi's was the best known of all the circulating libraries. It had started in 1842 and it continued right up to the 1930s. The photograph is taken from behind the service desk and from the gallery, and you can see the gallery running around the top of the room. What can we deduce about this photograph? Well, I've marked out the subscribers, the borrowers in the circulating library. I think it's pretty obvious they're very respectable just by looking at their elaborate hats. The hats give you an idea of the class of people who frequented the circulating libraries. Circulating libraries were basically private libraries that you could join for a fixed fee every year. The cheapest subscription that one could have at Moody's was a guinea a year. That's £1.05 today. It doesn't sound much, but in the mid-19th century it was over the average weekly wage. For that guinea, one could borrow one volume at a time. Now think of a subscription to Moody's like a subscription to a content provider like Sky. There were various levels of service you could pay for. Now notice I said that for one guinea you could borrow one volume, not one novel. For most circulating library novels were published in 3 volumes. Henry Dunbar in 1864 was no exception. 3-volume novels in the form that you can see on the screen were a staple of Victorian fiction publishing. They cost, as a set, 31 shillings and sixpence, an immense sum, and way beyond what the average person could afford. This was deliberate, as the publishers were in league with the circulating libraries. These circulating libraries bought the novels from the publishers generally at a considerable discount, perhaps 40% off, but the retail price to the ordinary consumer kept the novels way beyond the purchasing power of most people. For a guinea a year, as I've said, you could borrow one volume of the 3 at a time from a circulating library, unless you had a more expensive subscription, of course. Now, think of the advantages to the circulating library of the 3-volume novel for the ordinary subscription of one volume at a time. In theory, having a text split over several volumes ensured that no one kept each volume for very long, as they'd want the next one. That quick turnaround secures better circulation of stock for the libraries and also shows them what's popular. It also showed the publishers, indirectly, what was flying off the shelves and what not, and then what next steps to take and when. Now, if it's important for a novel to be split into 3 volumes, then a novelist will want to make sure that readers will want to read subsequent volumes. In the case of Henry Dunbar, let's have a look where the volumes are split. Mary Braddon ends the first volume of Henry Dunbar after chapter 17, as Anne-Marie Bella tells us. Henry has just arrived at his luxurious home in Portland Place, London, and met his daughter Laura and his stepdaughter Dora. He spent all night going through his papers before he completely destroys a photograph on glass. For photographs on glass were usual at the time, rather than photographs that we're used to on film. Photographic film, in fact, only came into use in the 1880s. Henry Dunbar reduces the glass photograph to nothing more than a sparkling dust, which he scatters about, we assume, so as to make it less noticeable. He goes to bed after 6 a.m., but at 3 p.m. that afternoon he leaves London with Laura and Dora for his country house. What has he done, and why has he done it? How safe are Laura and Dora going to be with him? Perhaps the next volume will reveal all. Volume 2 ends with chapter 34. Now, something's happened in chapter 32. Margaret has, it seems, seen Henry Dunbar at last, but we never find out what happens at her interview with him. Now, though, she's decided to break her engagement with her beloved Clement Austen, whom she now starts calling Mr. Austen again. He's very upset when she says, "Farewell, Clement," using his first name for what may be the last time. He replies formally with Miss Wilmot. And at the end, the polite formalities are executed punctiliously. He sends her in a fast carriage to the station with a waiter from the inn to help her with her luggage. She leaves, she says, for London. But what's happened? Why has she broken off her engagement when it's evident she loves Clement? It's a bit of a shock, since Braddon has led us to understand that Margaret and Clement are very suited to one another, for even if Clement is a rather silly romantic with not very good ideas about women, he has a good heart, and Margaret is a very decent woman. What has she discovered that makes her ruin her future? What is she going to do in London? You can understand then, even from the quick discussion of the end of the first two volumes, that the three-volume novel imposed certain constraints on the form of the novel. Writers, if they were to be loved of readers, had to give readers a reason to come back for the next volume. They therefore had to organize their plots to end on cliffhangers of various sorts. You will also have understood that Mary Braddon was a mistress of form. As I've said before, she was, in this sense, a mistress of time, seeking to control not only how we read the clues in the narrative, in what order we read them, and in what order we discover various events, but also seeking to ensure that we will want to read in the future, that we will return to the circulating library for our next volume. She's seeking to act on our bodies in this particular way. She wants us to return to the circulating library. Now, I said earlier that if publishers found the novel was popular in the circulating library, after a while, at least several months and perhaps a year after the novel was published in three-volume form, the novel might be republished in one volume, in a form we're much more familiar with. The popularity of the three-volume novel in the circulating library could be taken then as a clue that there would be a retail market for the novel, that is, that it would sell to individual customers at an appropriate price point. On the screen in front of you, you can see two editions of Henry Dunbar that I own. The one on the left, the smaller one, came out in April 1865, 11 months after the three-volume edition. The one on the right is a later edition from the 1890s. Now, these single-volume versions were much cheaper than the three-volume one. At 6 shillings, they cost around 30p in today's money. That sounds incredibly cheap, but they were actually quite expensive if your only income was £1 a week. Single volumes like these will have been rebound by professional bookbinders so that the volumes are safely encased in embossed leather and marbled boards. That would have added to the consumer's expense. These aren't really cheap, for to sell a novel really cheaply would be to lower its status in the market and alienate its target readership, which was middle class, even in the cheap version. But at least the form of the novel wasn't affected by the need to make readers return for the next volume to the circulating library. Perhaps, too, a novel might be taken up by the German publisher Tauchnitz in Leipzig. He made a speciality of reprinting novels in paperback, especially for British holidaymakers in Europe. They were not very cheap, 1 mark 60 or 2 francs, which translates as about 80p today. You could of course get cheaper single volumes in Britain, but that was the point. You weren't in Britain if you bought these Tauchnitz editions. Now, I don't have a Tauchnitz edition of Henry Dunbar, I'm afraid, but this is another novel by Braddon, Rough Justice, which was published in the 1890s, that I do have a copy of. Though Tauchnitz prefers 2 volumes, not 3 for long novels, and when he could have preferred to publish in just 1 volume. Unlike British publishers, he was publishing for retail to readers, not sale to lending libraries. But of course, this is a very, very middle-class audience with quite a lot of spare cash, because these paperbacks were targeting readers on holiday in the continent. And in case you're wondering, I put my hand in the picture and in the previous picture to give you an idea of scale. The cheap editions are designed for easy transportation, for reading on trains perhaps. But more of that in the next video. So, Henry Dunbar was published in 3 volumes for a readership with a good deal of spare cash. A readership that could afford a subscription to lending libraries such as Moody's, and then it was republished in a single volume at a price point, or at several price points, that also kept it clearly within a middle-class market. You can't be surprised then if I say that sensation novels usually involve crime in middle-class families, usually pretty well-to-do ones actually. The plots of the stories center on people like the readers of the stories, are often ones that were rather better off, but not so much better off that they were unrecognizable. We're talking of the world of music teachers, bank clerks, solicitors, perhaps even detectives and their wives. However, we draw that conclusion because on the whole we read middle-class versions of these stories and choose to read middle-class tales like Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White and The Moonstone, or this version of Henry Dunbar. Some sensation fiction had far more lowly origins. Henry Dunbar was one of those. As Anne-Marie Bella makes clear in her introduction to the edition I'm recommending to you, Henry Dunbar was originally a serial novel in a penny weekly fiction magazine, the London Journal. And here we come to another of what Mansel proposed as the origins of sensation fiction: periodicals. It was penny periodicals that most people could afford to read. It was in these penny fiction weeklies that most people encountered their fiction. By the mid-1850s, while Dickens's twopenny Household Words magazine was enjoying a steady sale of 38,000 a week, the 4 main mass-market periodicals of the time, penny fiction weeklies, the London Journal, the Family Herald, Reynolds's Miscellany, and Cassell's Illustrated Family Paper, these were cumulatively selling almost 2 million copies a week. Based on calculations usual at the time of 4 to 6 readers per issue, that meant that their readership of maybe 12 million comprised over 50% of the British population. That is an incredible media penetration that today's media producers can only dream of. It recalls the media penetration of television programs such as Coronation Street in the early 1960s. The owners of these penny fiction weekly magazines made vast sums. Biggs, the first publisher and proprietor of the Family Herald, left a fortune of almost £50,000 when he died in 1859. In the 1860s, W.S. Johnson, the then owner of the London Journal, was making £1,000 per month from that periodical alone. This at a time when the average wage was just £4 or £5 a month. Edward Lloyd, who published periodicals, newspapers, and serial novels, was the most successful of them all, leaving no less than £565,240 at his death in 1890. Such incomes put these men well within the richest 1% of Victorian Britain. They are Henry Dunbars. There was a huge amount of money to be made from periodicals, and it's no wonder that it was called at the time economic literature. I've argued in a piece in the Companion to Sensation Fiction edited by Pamela Gilbert that cheap fiction displayed all the elements of what we think of today as sensation fiction decades before the 1860s, when sensation fiction is supposed to have arisen. Other critics have sagely found even earlier antecedents. We don't have time, unfortunately, to explore all those, but I highly recommend you turn to Pamela Gilbert's excellent and very readable companion to sensation fiction. However, I do want to say a few words about the version of Henry Dunbar that appeared in the illustrated penny fiction weekly, The London Journal. Henry Dunbar, as I've said previously, was originally called The Outcasts. It was published in the London Journal over the autumn and winter and spring of 1863 to 64. A serial like this has a different relationship to time and form than the three-volume novel. But we don't have space to discuss that. It's an excellent topic if you want to do a dissertation on it. What I do want to show you are some of the front pages of the issues in which The Outcast was featured on the front page. Many of you will recognize the events illustrated. The conversation in the bank between Sampson, Clement, and Balderby, for example. The removal of Sampson from the train after his seizure. Henry Dunbar and the verger in Winchester Cathedral. And, of course, the inquest with a rather too stiff Henry Dunbar. But you won't have recognized all of them. The very first one, for instance. I'm not going to go into all the details of the differences between the Outcasts and Henry Dunbar. As I say, that would be a fantastic topic for a dissertation or even an article. But I will note the removal of the very first scene from the three-volume novel form. In The Outcast, we first meet Jocelyn Gilbert, who will become Laura Dunbar's husband, as a struggling artist married to an alcoholic wife. He's worried that his wife will take their son Georgie away from him and bring the child up away from his father, so that father and child will lose contact. Jocelyn wants Georgie tattooed so he will be able to recognize him in later life. For Georgie consenting to be tattooed is what we see in the first illustration. The big reveal at the end of the first episode, after several pages of emphasizing Jocelyn's wretched poverty, is that Jocelyn may in fact be an aristocrat. When we later meet him marrying Laura Dunbar, what secrets he's carrying with him! Altogether 2 explosive secrets, and 2 working class for a 3-volume circulating library readership. Bigamy only avoided by wife murder. Detailed description of grinding poverty and alcoholism. Tattooing a child? Certainly not. May be hard for us to understand today, but when we mix and match high and low culture so that we don't even recognize the distinction between them, that's a very recent phenomenon. Keeping the 2 apart existed certainly in the 19th century and well into the 20th. There were strenuous attempts to keep low or popular culture apart from high elite culture. Unless one were devoted to radical politics, there was a shame in being known to have catered for a popular working class readership. You can see this at work in this extract from a review of Henry Dunbar in the Edinburgh Evening Courant, which appeared a fortnight after Henry Dunbar became available in the circulating libraries. You can find that I've used Artemis to locate this source. I'm very struck by how the review picks up a central theme of Henry Dunbar, the concealing of origins, and transfers it to the origins of Henry Dunbar, the novel. The review reveals the origins of the novel Henry Dunbar under a changed name, just as the novel reveals the origins of the character Henry Dunbar under an assumed name. There's a lot one can say about this piece, and indeed of being ashamed of one's ancestors, but I think it's important to point out how reinvention of one's identity was typically mid-19th century. What was happening in society was that the middle classes were growing. They were incorporating members whose parents had been working class. and in order to legitimate themselves by trying to make it appear that they had always been middle class, such new members of middle classes might seek to conceal their precise parentage, their working class origins. They seek to conceal their original identities by inventing themselves anew, perhaps not changing their names, but changing where they lived, or their habits, or their accents. Of course, such self-fashioning, as it has been called by critics, was by no means new in the 19th century, but it was more widespread. Urbanization on a vast scale allowed it. It's much easier to become another person, to invent yourself or reinvent yourself if you move to a city than if you stay in your village where everyone's known you since birth. And indeed, cities were now so vast that you can remain anonymous within them. You could conceal yourself in a city. Joseph Wilmot does this, of course, first reinventing himself by a simple change of surname and remaining anonymous in the metropolis. And then he reinvents himself on a sensational and criminal scale. Margaret, meanwhile, is ashamed of the crimes of her father and has in the end to learn that she doesn't have to be ashamed. Clement Austin accepts her for who she really is, a decent human being. Clearly here, the Edinburgh Evening Courant is perhaps not as forgiving as Clement Austin, but at least the reviewer is amused by the preface, which asks reviews not to reveal the plot, and so perhaps the reviewer is just entering into the game of detection, after all, rather than completely condemning the object, the perpetrator of this crime of reinvention. In the next video, I'll continue the investigation of sensation novels in general, and Henry Dunbar in particular, by looking at the influence of railways and the theatre. I look forward to seeing you again.